So tonight I'm going to talk about habits of the body, and my talk has 4 parts. At first, I'll talk about our style of physical Zen as a way to provide some context. Next, I'll talk about habits as attachments that reside in the body. And I'm also going to talk about Zazen as a type of body work and the body as a Zen dojo or a place of resolving duality. And as I was preparing this talk, the place I got was sort of reflecting that a lot of what I was saying was very basic or obvious. But I think it's really fundamental to our style of Zen training. And so I thought it was relevant to talk about during this 90-day training when we're focused on habits. And we also have a lot of new people who may find it helpful to hear in terms of learning more about our tradition. A lot of what I'm going to say too is very personal or embedded in my subjective experience. And I don't really know another way to talk about bodies in terms of, talking about them in the abstract. So I appreciate you listening to me and maybe reflecting in yourself whether some of this resonates as true for you, or you can find it in your own experience. So I think our training may be unusual in terms of its emphasis on the physical or the body as an entry point for Zen. We pretty much overemphasize this point. You'll never hear a teacher in our lineage refer to the term mindfulness. If there was a term like bodyfulness, we might use that. But things you will hear us talk about is posture, or the alignment of the body and gravity. You'll hear us talk about the breath. You'll also hear us talk a lot about samadhi, and that we have the definition White Law Roshi came up with for that, which is the state of relaxed concentration of no self. And this isn't a made-up idea. This is a real physical state that someone is either in or they're not, and it's discernible to the trained eye. You can see it in a person's face, in the quality of their voice, in the way that they move. And samadhi can either manifest as a mind that flows without stopping, or we could refer to it as empty or no mind, depending on the depth of the samadhi. And if you take your training to a deep level, we talk about resolving the great dualities, one of them being that the body is mind, mind is body. And we also talk about realizing that the true human body is the entire universe. So do you need a special type of body to do this type of Zen? The good news is that you don't. Any body works. You'll often hear people remark about people with years of hard physical training, either through martial arts or athletics, that they kind of have an advantage in terms of our style of Zen training. But I've also observed that people with physical challenges or illnesses seem to have an advantage too. I heard a lot early on in my training that being too smart can be a hindrance to making progress in Zen, and they may have been saying that to me, especially because I was that kind of person. But I think it's true what they're saying, what they said, because being too smart leads to being stuck in your own head, which was something I was definitely, um, prone to. Relying on the muscle of your brain to solve problems, which isn't going to get you very far in Zen. And also thinking you have all the answers when you should be having questions. Um, and it's funny that Honda Roshi is joining us here tonight because I plan to tell an anecdote. So Honda Roshi is a natural athlete. He's also a retired high school shop teacher. And he once told me that my body was special ed. And so I tell you that because I may have begun at a lower place in my a lower starting point in my training than most people. And if that serves as any inspiration to you all, I'd like you to use it. So in terms of attachments being things that reside in your body, White Law Roshi introduced us to the quote by Amori Sogen, who was fond of saying that the purpose of the Hojo Kata, which is a set of sword forms, was to take away every habit we've been accumulating since the day we were born. And we could say that this more broadly applies to our Zen training as well. And we've probably all heard about this Buddhist concept of attachments, which I'm going to define simply as clinging to things as being different than the way that they actually are. Another way to think about it is making things be about ourselves. And the claim that I'm going to make is that these attachments reside in our bodies. They've been accumulating since our birth or even before that, and they manifest themselves as habitual patterns of tension. And I want to clarify also that I'm not really talking about injuries and like scar tissues, which literally are like kinds of attachments in the tissues where you the tissue locks together and you lose pliability. But you could imagine that the set of compensating movements or patterns of thought that you have around those injuries could lead to the type of thing that I'm talking about in terms of attachment. But I'm more talking about the way different parts of your body may be locked up and shut down, not moving freely. It's sort of like an injury, but most of the time you're not really conscious of why you have it or even the fact that it exists until you discover it or someone points it out to you. And I'm going to share a few of my own experiences of this. So from my very first session, which was probably 20 years ago, I've suffered quite a bit of pain in my right hip. And I'm a very flexible person. I'm the kind of person who could, go all the way down to the floor when stretching. So it's not really clear like why I had this tight right hip. But for whatever reason, from the moment, the very first session that I went to, I had like pretty profound pain in my right hip. And I wanted to show you an image that would come to me as I was sitting Zazen. Let's see if I can share my screen. So I was a vegetarian, but for some reason, this is the image that would come to me was of a chicken carcass with its drumstick just kind of being ripped out of its its carcass body. And every time it would happen to me, this is the image that I would get, as I was sitting Zazen. And I made up all sorts of stories about this pain that I was having. I thought maybe I had a congenital deformity. There must be some explanation, for why I was experiencing this pain. Um, and the evidence I had that there was a problem besides the pain was that when I sat, my right knee was about 4 inches off the ground. Like I couldn't get it to touch the ground. Whereas the other knee would be resting comfortably on the ground. So during this first session that I was at, during one of the really long sits, the pain was building up, and it felt like you're almost like a teapot, getting ready to like boil over. The pressure is building up, and I got to the point where I'm thinking, this isn't sustainable. Like, I need to do something. Like, I need to give up, give in, let go, something. And I did that. And when you make that kind of decision, you don't really know what's going to happen, like, am I going to fall over? Like, do I need all of this tension to actually stay up? So it's kind of exciting. And I did it. I let go of all the gripping and I just relaxed. And when I did that, I surprised myself. I stayed upright, and all of a sudden my right knee dropped to the ground. So, a good 4 inches. And my breath dropped into my hara, and that was dramatic as well. And the pain and the energetic content, that came out of my hip when this happened was next level. Like, if your doctor asked you to rate it on a scale from 1 to 10, it's definitely like a 20. And so I found myself, with tears running down my face. And even at that point, if you asked me why I was crying, it wasn't really because of the pain. It was this realizing that I was holding that hip there. I was the one causing that pain. I was my own worst enemy. That was the realization that I had that was so shocking to me. And after that point, I realized that with loosened hips, I no longer was falling, my legs weren't falling asleep. I could stand up when I needed to for kinhin. So it was a pretty dramatic shift. And this kind of experience repeated itself for many session, so after a few days, it would tighten up again. And then I would repeat the process next time. And to some extent, it's still happening. Like we just did Zazen Kai yesterday, and I was laughing with Christy that, I was preparing this talk and, thinking about my hip problem, but, it showed up again. It's not as bad as it used to be, but the residual thing is still there. The other thing that I noticed at this phase in my Zen training was that when my right hip was closed, my right leg and my buttocks were tense, they were tight. And when it was open, the leg and the buttocks were relaxed, and that there was almost like a phase shift in my personality between these two states. So when my right hip was closed, I had social anxiety. I was prone to focusing on petty things. When the right hip was open, I was more confident, magnanimous. And so I came to joke that my ego lived in my right hip, rather than my brain. And it sounds like a funny thing, but it felt more true than not. I also noticed that when I became nervous, I would automatically tighten up my right leg and my hip. And once I noticed this, I could relax it again. But it was kind of exhausting, always staying on top of it. And so eventually it would close up again until next session. And I later ended up figuring out through body work and different somatic therapies that I did that I had a tight psoas muscle on that side and a tight sacroiliac joint. And so I was able to, at this point, I've worked with Ellen, who's a student in our school. So I have like a series of exercises that I do that I can keep my hip more open. But that habit is still there, it's just to a lesser degree. Another habit I'll tell you about, it I figured it out during another session in Kushner Roshi's basement. And I'm going to show you a photo of that and see if you can figure out what it is. Okay, so this is me. On the left is I'm 17 years old. I think it's 1995. I'm standing on a train platform in Yokohama, Japan, with my my homestay sister, and that was the closest approximation I could get to the age I started, which was about 23. I started training in Zen. And the picture on the right is it's 2006. I'm 28 years old, so that's 5 years into my Zen training. And it's probably about around the time that I figured out this issue, but it's not fully resolved yet. So does anybody have any idea what the habit I had was? This is audience participation.
Maybe having one shoulder higher than the other.
Yes. So which shoulder is it?
The right shoulder was down and the left one was higher.
Exactly. So every picture I have until a certain age, my left shoulder is always higher than my right shoulder. And yeah, by the way, like I don't know if there's any game like this that I find like more delightful than seeing people like before they started Zen training. Because we're sort of in the transformation business, and if something didn't change before and after, then man, something's not right. But if you look at these pictures, like especially the one when I'm 17 on the left, my shoulder is like really tight, and the arm is like that too. And I remember when I went to my first session in Chicago, the same one I was talking about, there was a Roshi that observed to me that my left arm didn't swing freely at all when I walked. And you'll often get things like this pointed out to you. Other evidence that I have of this problem, like when I was preparing for this talk and looking for photos, was I found pictures from my very first set of 10 sessions for Zen therapy. They go through systematically through all your different body parts and kind of do really deep tissue massage to work out the issues and realign your posture. And I found pictures where the body worker had drawn, it was sort of before and after, and they had drawn a line with pen, a straight line, showing that my shoulder was higher than the other, and the incremental change that had happened afterwards. But what I realized during the session was similar to what I realized with my hip, that I was sort of just holding it there. And that at a certain point, I just decided I didn't want to hold it there anymore. And so I just let it drop. And wow, I mean, what a difference that makes. And to realize, how much energy you've been investing into carrying around a shoulder like that for all your life. It's a simple thing, but it's actually quite mind blowing. And once you know that you have a habit like that, and you create some muscle memory around what it takes to let go of that habit, you can do something about it, right? But the habits will often return when you're not looking. Um, and it's interesting, why that might happen. Like I often wake up from sleeping like this, right? And so that's kind of a mysterious thing. Um, I want to talk for a minute about the concept of karma. We don't use the word karma very often in our tradition either, but we do use the word jike, which means habit energy. And the classic kind of story we tell about that to illustrate how it works is a shoyu barrel. So in, maybe even now in Japan, they made shoyu in wooden barrels. And so the story goes that if you dump out the shoyu out of that barrel and you wash it out, like say you washed it out 3 times and you tried to drink the water, you'd still have pretty salty water, right? But even if you washed it out like 30 times or 300 times and you drank that water, you'd still be able to taste some like shoyu in it, right? It wouldn't be the same as if you drank it out of like a cleanly washed glass. It would still have that residue. And it's the same with our bodies. And they say that 98% of the atoms in your body get replaced in a year. So it's kind of weird, right, that your body can maintain habits at all. Like with everything being replaced, with you being like new, every year approximately. It's kind of weird that you could have a habit that stays with you like 21 years or whatever until you go to sesshin. you know like what's that about? And there's some sort of like energetic clinging or attachment. There's something that keeps remaking itself. It's through our posture, it's through our ways of thinking, our ways of experiencing the world. Something about our habits gets hardwired. And it's sort of similar to identity creation. You keep remaking yourself more or less in the same image each day, but it's 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 some sort of mystery because the thing doesn't exist, right? Only the conception or you know the habit does. The actual thing is different. And so sometimes when your habit releases, you may get some sort of visual or a story that goes with it because it may be related to a particular experience. But more often, like nothing really happens. It's like I said, in terms of my stories, like the thing just goes away because it's more related to identity, the concept of creating you, um, your own identity, the concept that I exist. So at some point, we usually recommend that Zen students undergo, um, some sort of somatic therapy, like body work. There's a particular school of body work, or maybe even two, associated with our lineage. There are different somatic therapies that people find are useful. I know I've done several, and I think most serious Zen students have similar experiences. And it's definitely something that's helpful to come back to at different stages in your training, because there's different levels of progress that'll be available to you if you try. So next I'm going to talk about Zazen as a type of body work or corrective that you can perform on yourself. Green Roshi describes Zazen as manual labor. And I think this is really true. A lot of times doing Zazen feels like digging a ditch, like you're trying to make your exhalation as long as possible. And there's a lot of things that you need to internally like move out of the way, pull into alignment to actually make that happen. And it's hard work. The way I think of Zazen is like doing body work on yourself from the inside out. And there, like I was describing with my shoulder, there's some things that no amount of body work is going to help. Sometimes the things are internal and you have to fix them for yourself, or sometimes you need to actually decide, I'm not going to hold my shoulder like that anymore. Okay, and nobody else can give that to you. Early on, I didn't particularly like Zazen. So I was always asking questions about what I perceived would be like some point where there would be a permanent phase shift and I could just stop doing it. Like that was what I wanted to know. I wanted to know like when that was going to happen, and what it was going to be like. And I've got news for you that that time never comes. Zen Master Dogen has had a saying that Zazen isn't a means to enlightenment, but it's enlightenment itself. And there was a point in my training when I realized that that was really true. And I started appreciating Zazen as a type of medicine that I needed to remember, what I really was. So now I'm going to share another photo of how I conceptualize Zazen. So you guys have all seen this kind of poster, maybe in the Natural History Museum. This is the, evolution of man. And I would say on most days, I start off as the picture on the left. And hopefully, if I'm lucky, I finish Zazen, like the picture on the right. Zazen restores your posture, your breathing, your dignity. And for whatever reason, these habits creep back in, even when you're sleeping. And so something like this happens where, you go back to being that kind of monkey again that's bent over, and you need Zazen again. I wanted to share with you the story of my coming back to Zazen after cancer treatment. So there was about a year and a half when I had breast cancer, and I had to get multiple surgeries. I had to undergo chemotherapy, radiation therapy, and for that lasted about a year, and then maybe 6 months beyond that, I still wasn't sitting Zazen. And I found that for a long time during this treatment, I could kind of coast on fumes. Like I had trained pretty hard, and there were ways that my training was still manifest in my daily life, or at least in a way that I could perceive. But by the time I finished those 18 months and I still wasn't sitting Zazen, I basically had returned to the place that I was in when I started. And this was the reason I had started Zazen, this particular state. And so I kind of quietly just decided to myself that I needed to sit Zazen. Um, I wasn't sure that I was ever going to start doing hard Zen training again. I wasn't sure about sesshin. I wasn't even sure about training with as part of a group. Didn't know that I was really very interested in that. But I just restarted with this very kind of simple beginner's mind. Like I understood what that concept meant meant because I was very much there. I was very clear that I just had to do Zazen because that's what I needed to do. So in a way, I had lost my reason for training in Zen. You know, we all need that type of reason to keep going. And I felt like I had faced death and I had survived. And all I knew now at that point was that I needed Zazen to feel alive again. And I didn't have much aspiration beyond that. And my good friend, Alex Green, he held a body Zen training. I think it was his very first training like that in Spring Green. And because he was my friend, he was able to convince me to come and participate in that. And so I flew out, and the night before I even went to that training, I went to Bedford Street in Madison, Wisconsin, and I sat with Kushner Roshi and the small group there. And from, even before the Zazen ended, I was sure that I was going to start training in Zen again. It felt like coming home, and it felt like this delicious feeling of feeling normal again in my body. I didn't feel physically limited or broken in the way that I felt because of my cancer treatment. And I realized that Zazen was a habit in my body, a muscle memory that I had created that allowed me to restore my posture over time, but sometimes even just in the course of one Zazen. It was really amazing how fast and effective that it was. And so it wasn't like I was starting from scratch or even like I had lost a year and a half. To a large extent, it was like I was picking up where I left off. Maybe even further ahead than when I stopped because of this experience that I had gone through. So please build this habit of Zazen in your body so that it's accessible to you under all conditions when you need it. Because you never know where you're going to end up. So the last section I'm going to talk about is the body as a Zen dojo. So the definition of a Zen dojo that I got from Green Roshi is a place for resolving duality. And there was a point when we were ending fall Keishin, that's the online intensive training that we do over 4 days, where I found myself once again, completely tickled that this thing works. Like it seems like some sort of magic that this training online that's so different than any of us, do in person in many ways, that it works. But I found myself thinking, well, this kind of like self-satisfaction, isn't very helpful. Like, why does this thing work? Why does this thing work? And I focused on that as a question. And the thing that came back to me was that the body is the true Zen dojo. Sure, the schedule and the structure provided by Sesshin, by Keishin is helpful. Sure, rubbing up against, figuratively, other people that are on the path, um, all of those things are helpful. But your body is the minimal unit needed to resolve duality, and it's the entry point that's always accessible to you. So you need to become exquisitely sensitive to what's going on in your subjective experience and ask questions. And these will be, in my opinion, the best koans you ever have. So koans are the questions or the situations that your Zen teacher gives you in the context of Sanzen to work on and try to figure out. And often they're about other people, real people, and they might tell you, your teacher might tell you what place to read in a book about them, so you understand more about the context. But these questions that you could have about your own body, they're always relevant. They're not about a story you read, and they're about your favorite subject, which is you. And they're about right here and right now. So a few examples I'll give of this are during, again, in another sesshin context, this time in Spring Green, I'm sitting in the Greens kitchen, and I'm talking with Everett Ogawa and Alex Green. And I remember Everett said to me, again, we were talking about my hip, and he said, there's a lot of emotional content in people's hips. He was a body worker. And he said, I bet that's what's going on. There's something in your hips, that you need to figure out. And I thought, wow, maybe that's true. Maybe there's some thing there that I need to find and root out. And so I took that up as my koan. And I remember sitting on the Engawa, which is like the porch of the dojo, and focusing on the question, who is the one experiencing this excruciating pain in their hip? And, I'm really, really focused on this, really, really focused. And again, getting to that point where it's like, like the teapot's gonna start screeching, because the pressure is building up. And at that point, the wind kind of swept by, and the answer I got was, that's like asking, who is the wind? And again, tears start streaming. And, wow, that was probably the first time, a koan actually worked for me, that I got something back that was much different than the response that I could come up with in my own head. Another example I'll give is I was in Hawaii, and I was, I don't know, it might have been 5 years ago, I'm not sure, but I was working with Taiken Yokoyama on a kind of sanzen. I was there for 2 weeks, and I was working with him every day. And like a good Zen teacher, he was saying, no, 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 you don't have it, you know, and he was helping me build up this great doubt, that I needed. And the other part that I could feel though was that I was close, like something was close in a way that it hadn't been before. So, what I started asking myself was what part of me is holding back? What part of me isn't ready to jump off, the 100-foot pole? And so I was asking myself that during Zazen in the dojo. I was probably sitting by myself, not sure, but I remember that I was asking myself that, and the answer I got was that it was here in my heart. And the awareness of that resulted in a release. And it was like, Krishna Roshi's diagrams. Have you ever seen his diagrams of the Taoist conception of the body, where like the steam goes to meet the fire? And that thing happened to me. Like, I can say that that's true. It's only happened to me twice, but it's a crazy energetic feeling when the fire goes to meet the steam, or the steam goes to meet the fire. And that kind of experience directly contributed to my so-called Kensho experience during that time. And so those are some stories, but it doesn't have to be as dramatic as that. Like last week, I had a really, really bad day, and I got off my computer, and I went to go relax, and I couldn't relax because I felt so strung out by the experience of the day. And so I asked myself, what part of me is clinging to this bad day? And when I did that, I kind of realized that I was doing one of these, like, and then I could just let it go. And and then the attachment to that bad day went away with it. And there's all sorts of things you can deal with in this way, like toxic relationship dynamics, those live in your body too. There's all sorts of things that you can root out. You just need to locate the thing in your body, size it up, release it, open it. So my advice to you is to ask questions, to be okay with not knowing, and to see what happens, rather than trying to be smart and write the story before you know what it even is. So that's my talk, and I'm be interested to hear any of your own reactions or questions.